What's up folks, CrushSG back with another Diablo 4 video. So over the last 3 weeks to a month, I've put out maybe 4 or 5 Walking Arsenal build videos, and for those wondering why the published dates don't quite add up on this channel, it's because I decided to start this new channel exclusively for my Diablo 4 content, and I've spent the last few days kind of migrating and re-uploading all my Diablo 4 videos to this channel. Yeah, I know I lose the views and stuff, but honestly that really doesn't matter to me. I prefer the segregation in my channels. Anyway, now that Season 1 is around the corner and I've gotten to the point where I'm pretty confident I've explored and experimented as much as I can prior to Season 1, I figured it was a good time to kind of pull everything together into one video with all my most updated thoughts and build variations. This is probably going to be a longer video because I want to cover as much as I can, so let's not draw this out too much. Here's my Walking Arsenal Whirlwind Build Guide, version 2.0, Season 1 ready. So why Walking Arsenal? Simply put, I'm of the opinion that Walking Arsenal is hands down the best key passive barbarians have at the moment for starting a new barbarian, or in just about a week starting one in the new season. Walking Arsenal builds have almost no mandatory uniques or dropped aspect requirements, and they don't require a significant amount of attribute optimization to get going. And while this guide will focus specifically on Whirlwind, you can build almost any core skill into Walking Arsenal, so you aren't exactly going to be forced to play something unfamiliar by starting the season with a Walking Arsenal build. On the endgame front, Walking Arsenal can also take you pretty far into the endgame. Now, this is not some tier 100 capable build, at least I haven't cleared tier 100 with a Walking Arsenal build, but it isn't a stretch to say that you'll be able to take a Walking Arsenal build well into the high tier 70s or low tier 80s relatively quickly. What this does is it makes for an excellent low investment placeholder to use early in the season while you farm up for your desired late game builds, whatever that would be. I personally will still be playing Walking Arsenal likely all the way, but I know most folks, you're probably aiming for a triple shout unbridled rage meta build of sorts, so you can use this build as a placeholder until you get the gear or the level for the other meta builds. Okay, let's go over the basics first, and I'll talk about some variants later on. Walking Arsenal grants a 10% damage buff for each weapon type you deal direct damage with. Dual wield, 2-hand slashing, and 2-hand bludgeoning. Each buff lasts for 6 seconds. Additionally, you gain another 15% bonus damage while all 3 buffs are active. All the buffs are multiplicative, so the total bonus you get from having all buffs active is about 53%. As such, this means you'll need to have at least 3 skills on your bar that are weapon assignable, and you need to get into the habit of using all 3 skills in a certain rotation. Now, any skill that uses a weapon would technically work for this, but of course there are some skills that work better than others for this purpose. The one consistency between all my Walking Arsenal builds are that they have a high berserk and vulnerable uptime, so my skill choices and recommendations will reflect that. Looking at skills first, for basic skills, the mobility and the berserking provided by Lunging Strike is a hard one to beat, especially for a season starter build, though other basic skills like Flay could actually work well too, depending on the situation. Flay is great because it provides us with a second source of vulnerable, as well as a bit of damage reduction. Both of these are useful later on in the endgame. For the core skill, now on the surface, Whirlwind might not seem like the best core skill to use with Walking Arsenal because it is a channeled skill. However, I personally feel that Whirlwind is actually very well suited for Walking Arsenal because it is the only core skill that can utilize the Mortal Draw glyph. Mortal Draw provides up to 162% damage and 18% crit chance when using a skill that swaps to a new weapon. From an offensive standpoint, Mortal Draw has the potential to provide the largest buff of all the offensive glyphs. The problem with this glyph is it only affects the first skill used after swapping, making it not quite great for other core skills like Hota or Double Swing, which tend to be cast multiple times in quick succession. Now Whirlwind on the other hand snapshots this damage and crit bonus at the start of the channel, allowing it to gain the damage and the crit bonus for its entire duration. So that should explain why I went with Whirlwind for all my Walking Arsenal builds. So that's the basic skill and the core skill. We need a third skill for Walking Arsenal, and for that skill my top recommendation would be Death Blow, especially in the early game, because that's when you can quite reliably one-shot stuff and of course reset the cooldown of Death Blow. Now, eventually I recommend going with both Death Blow and Rupture as soon as possible, especially before you acquire the Weapon Mastery utility aspect, which is a dropped aspect. This ensures that you're able to reliably keep both the Walking Arsenal buff and vulnerable up on enemies by alternating between the two skills. Now once you have acquired the Weapon Master aspect, you can consider dropping either Death Blow or Rupture, but honestly keeping both of them is an option as well, because they provide you with almost a 100% vulnerable uptime with access to a chunky 3-second Berserk buff from Death Blow. So now that we have our 3 Walking Arsenal skills, for weapon assignments, if you use both Rupture and Death Blow, you want to ensure both of these skills have the same assigned weapon. Now if you just use one Weapon Mastery skill, then you simply need to ensure that all your 3 skills have different weapons assigned to them. Alright, for the remaining skills, 2 of them are mandatory, and those are Rallying Cry and Iron Skin. For Rallying Cry, we want to take Tactical Rallying Cry for the Fortify buff. This generates a huge amount of Fortify very quickly and is quite possibly the quickest way to get fully fortified from empty. Of course, Rallying Cry is also taken as our first source of Unstoppable, and Iron Skin would be our second source via the Iron Warrior aspect. Alright, so that covers 5 skills. For the final skill, it depends on whether you take both Rupture and Death Blow or just one of them. If you take both like I do, that's all your 6 skills right there. If you dropped one of them, you now have a free skill slot, of which my personal recommendation would either be Challenging Shout or Ground Stomp. Alright, that's it for skills. Let's talk about the aspects, and as I mentioned earlier, my Walking Arsenal builds are all fully functional with just Codex aspects, and you can then upgrade them to the dropped versions as you go. So we have 4 slots assigned to defensive aspects: Chest, Pants, Helm, and Amulet. I almost always recommend having Disobedience on the Amulet because it scales the best compared to the other alternatives. For the remaining 3 slots, we want Iron Warrior in the first, Might or Iron Blooded in the second, and Numbing Wrath or Steadfast Berserker for the third. Now, Numbing Wrath is a better choice for the most part because it provides a more consistent Fortify generation, and it is also available from the Codex. Steadfast Berserker is a dropped aspect and it provides chunky generation, but it is far less consistent. On to resource aspects, and these are the ones that go on your rings. So in the early game, before you find all the drop aspects and all of that, you want to start off with Relentless Arms Master and Umbral on both your rings, eventually moving on to Berserk Fury when you find it. A perfect rolled Berserk Fury aspect takes care of all your Fury generation needs, so you'll actually be able to free up a ring slot for an offensive aspect later on. For utility aspects, we generally run 2 of them, one on the boots, one on the gloves. The first would be Weapon Master for the extra charge to your Weapon Mastery skills. It is not 100% mandatory, especially in the early to mid game, but I would consider this one mandatory in the end game. Now for the second utility aspect, you have a couple of options. You can go with Relentless Berserker for Berserk uptime, or you could go with the aspect of Anemia for additional stuns. It's really personal preference. I personally use Anemia only with my dual wield setup, and I keep Relentless Berserker for everything else that is two-handed. Okay, finally we get to the offensive aspects, and we run 4 or 5 offensive aspects in most of my builds. The mandatory 2 are Edge Masters and Limitless Rage. I recommend putting these on two-handed weapons, but there is room for some personal preference here. If you use a two-handed or one-handed mace for Whirlwind, you can add the aspect of Retribution to the mandatory list. For the remaining aspects, we have a few choices. In the early to mid game, you could have the aspect of Dire Whirlwind on a two-handed weapon for the bonus crit. I know many barbarians tend to keep Dire Whirlwind on a two-handed weapon well into the endgame, but in my experience, I found it to be unnecessary. Once you're able to attain over 35 or 40% base crit chance, you can consider having Dire Whirlwind on a one-handed weapon or a ring. I personally don't even use Dire Whirlwind at all, and as you can see from the gameplay that I'll be showing throughout the video, I don't exactly have a crit chance problem. Now the next aspect is the aspect of the expectant, and this is a good one to consider in the late game. Now it is available from the codex, but really you should be only using this if you find a perfectly rolled version to minimize the number of basic attacks required to max out the buff. And of course, you want this aspect on either a one-handed weapon or a ring because the total bonus is fixed at 30%. It doesn't benefit from being put on a two-handed weapon. Now up next we have one of my favorite optional aspects, Dust Devils. Dust Devils is a great aspect for supplementary AoE damage. Now I had initially thought that Dust Devil damage benefits from just crit damage and vulnerable damage, but I suspect it could benefit from more sources of damage than that because with the base value of 1.4k on my Dust Devils aspect, I'm seeing crits of upwards of 300 to 400k, so it's gotta be getting that bonus damage from somewhere. Anyway, I guess that's something for the number crunchers to do, so we'll see if any of the number crunchers crunch anything out of this. Alright, the final offensive aspect is more utility than damage, and that is the accelerating aspect. This just increases the execution speed of our entire rotation, making it feel much more fluid. It is especially useful for speeding up the rupture animation. Now it's personal preference, I urge you to give it a try and see if you like it. Alright, that's it for aspects. Now we go on to gear, and because there aren't any mandatory uniques for any of my builds, I will instead talk about general attribute priorities for each slot. Starting with the helm, we always want to have total armor and max HP if possible. For the remaining two slots, we want to look at strength, death blow ranks, cooldown reduction, or maybe a specific resistance. Max Fury can also be considered if you run a dual wield build with Mobalytics' unique sword, and all stats can be considered in place of strength if you need the stats specifically for your Paragon board. Moving on to the chest and the pants, these two pieces have the same requirements. We want total armor as the top priority, then we have pure damage reduction, and that's always a good option because it is universal, but you might find better results going for a combination of the situational damage reductions like close, bleeding, fortified for the three remaining slots. Onto the gloves, and we want whirlwind ranks and crit chance as priorities, followed by attack speed, strength, damage to injured, or lucky hit chance. Now similar to the accelerating aspect, attack speed is great on gloves for speeding up the rotation. I've personally found that having a good attack speed roll on gloves can remove the need to have the accelerating aspect entirely. Onto the boots, and we want berserk duration, fortify generation, and movement speed as priorities. For the last slot, we either want strength, movement speed on elite kill, damage reduction while injured, or maybe a specific resistance. For the amulet, we want total armor, damage reduction, and ranks to one of the offensive passives as the priorities, with cooldown reduction, situational damage reduction, and maybe defensive skill ranks as the options for the fourth slot. Now the reason why I didn't mention Fury cost reduction is because Fury cost reduction is actually optional in Walking Arsenal builds, but if you are planning to eventually switch to an Unbridled Rage build, you probably want to consider having both cooldown reduction and Fury cost reduction on your amulet. Now for the rings, we obviously want crit chance, crit damage, and vulnerable damage as the top priorities, followed by either max HP, close damage, or Fury generation. You can consider having max Fury instead of close damage if you run Mobalytics, but it is optional. Close damage is pretty much just as good as max Fury because Mobalytics doesn't scale as well with max Fury versus something like Hota. You can also consider having core skill damage instead of close damage if you are building toward eventually using Unbridled Rage. Alright, lastly for weapons, we want crit damage, vulnerable damage, pure strength, followed by either close damage or all stats, depending on whether you need stats for your Paragon board. Again, if you're building towards Unbridled Rage eventually, you want to have core skill damage instead of close damage. Okay, that's it for gear. Let's go over the Paragon board, and over the past month I've gradually been refining and optimizing my Paragon board to what I feel is now the most optimal route to take from starting a new Barbarian all the way into the endgame to minimize potential respeccing as far as possible. I'll be using a build editor to showcase this, and I'll go over a mid-game version of it followed by the endgame version of it for two-handed weapons, because a vast majority will probably be running a two-handed weapon for Whirlwind. I'll talk about dual wield in its own section later. Alright, for the mid-game, which is approximately level 50 to 70, I'll be planning just 4 Paragon boards with the focus being purely offensive, meaning you will need to do some limited point shuffling later on to optimize for the endgame. So starting with the base board, we want to go up the offensive side, populating the glyph area with dexterity nodes. There is 39 dexterity in radius of the first glyph, and in here you want to put the exploit glyph for the vulnerable damage and vulnerable uptime. From here we take the offensive side up to the second board, and that will be the decimator board. Moving vertically up the board, we want to branch out and take every possible vulnerable damage node along the way. Now the glyph area on this board actually has a potential for 54 willpower, but we will not be choosing a willpower glyph. Instead, we will be going with the might glyph because it gives bonuses to the surrounding vulnerable nodes. Thus, we only need 40 strength in radius here. From here, we then make a beeline straight upwards and exit the board from the top. Now, I know some of you might be wondering why I didn't just exit to the left, because it seems to save points. Now, this is because eventually we want to be taking this physical damage node in the late game. So going up in that case makes it the most point-efficient route. So you see, respecking and reassigning certain points here and there, that's perfectly fine at higher levels, but what you really don't want to be doing is respecking all the way down to the second board just to change the route at which you exit the board. By my calculations, going this route allows you to save about 2 Paragon points. Just optimizations, folks. Anyway, the third board would be the Flawless Technique board, and this is our crit damage and willpower board. Going up the right side, we want to take every willpower node in radius for a total of 54 willpower, and we also want to take all the damage reduction nodes along the way. Here we place the Undaunted glyph for the fortified damage and fortified damage reduction. Moving to the left, we ignore the one-handed crit nodes here, and we take all the general crit nodes up here and exit the board on the left. Moving on to the fourth board, and we are picking the Blood Rage board, which has a potential for 70 strength in radius of the glyph, and that's why we put the Ire glyph in this slot. Ire gives damage and damage reduction from elites while berserking. Now, although it has 70 strength in radius, you will notice that I only assign 65 strength to this glyph. And the reason is because this particular strength node here is not efficient to take. It takes 2 points to get to one strength node without any surrounding strength nodes. Now we take the damage to bleeding nodes along the way, as well as the damage reduction from bleeding targets before we exit to the top. Alright folks, that's the mid-game board, and this should comfortably take you to about level 65, level 70, it really depends on the state of your renown. From here you can either choose to continue down the Walking Arsenal rabbit hole, or of course, respec if you want to go for a more meta triple shout unbridled rage build. That's entirely up to you, but if you go that route, you're going to have to find a different channel for a meta guide, because I don't do meta guides on this channel. As for my fellow off-meta lovers who are sticking around, welcome to the non-conformity club. Let's continue. For the fifth board, we want to go with the Carnage board, which has 44 dexterity in radius of the glyph. At this point, we want to remove the exploit glyph from the first board and place it here, putting the Mortal Draw glyph in the first board instead. We then take the berserk damage and close damage reduction nodes along the way before exiting to the left. For the sixth and final board, we're going to go with the Bonebreaker board, but I planned it this way just in case you prefer to run the Warbinger board for the Fortified Generation. Both these boards are 49 dexterity boards, so they are both interchangeable. I personally don't run Warbinger because I feel that it brings good value only if you run Unbridled Rage, but it's really personal preference. Bonebreaker gives us access to much more defensive and offensive nodes, which is why I personally use it. So on this board, we want to take all the dexterity nodes and the damage reduction while healthy nodes, and once we have all the dex nodes, we want to move Mortal Draw from the first board and place it here, putting the Territorial glyph on the first board instead. Territorial gives damage to close and damage reduction from close targets. Now at this point you should be about level 80 to 90 depending on your renown, and entering into the late game where you'll be pushing higher nightmares, so you might want to make some optimizations to the first board if you want to. Basically what we're doing is just swapping the offensive nodes to the defensive nodes, up on the left side here instead of the right side, and up the right side here instead of the left. But of course we are still taking the rare nodes on each side. It's just maybe 100 difference in armor. It's purely for optimization, so it's not mandatory to do this. Now as you continue leveling up to 100, you have two choices. You either take all the defensive nodes here and here if you are pushing for higher nightmares, or you can choose to take all the offensive nodes possible if you just want to optimize for damage and speed runs. Alright, and that's the base template for the Paragon tree, folks. Let's go over all the build variants that I recommend, starting with the leveling build. So leveling as a barbarian, I would recommend you assign either a two-handed sword or dual wield one-handed swords to Whirlwind because it is just more skill point efficient this way. Two-handed swords deal higher hit damage and provide a decent amount of bleed damage, while one-handed swords eventually give you a very decent amount of fury generation for longer spin time. For more specific tips on how to make your leveling experience better, check out my video on 10 mistakes new barbarian players should avoid. I talk about stats, gear, skill priorities, in much more detail in that video. I'll just be going over the skill tree in this video, and I'll also provide a Mobalytics link in the description for a step-by-step skill point selection for the leveling build. Okay, starting off we take Lunging Strike, followed by Enhanced Lunging Strike to gain access to the Whirlwind cluster, which we put 1 point into. We then take Enhanced Whirlwind for a bit of Fury recovery, followed by Furious Whirlwind for the bleed. We then put 1 more point into Whirlwind to unlock the defensive cluster. Next we take Rallying Cry, followed by Iron Skin, then Enhanced Rallying Cry and Tactical Rallying Cry, followed by Enhanced Iron Skin and Tactical Iron Skin. Now what this provides you is a good amount of fury generation, unstoppable, and a nice emergency heal. From here we go 3 points into Swiftness for the run speed, which is important at lower levels before you get run speed on your boots. And then 1 more point into Whirlwind would unlock the Weapon Master cluster. From here we take Death Blow, which is one of the best leveling skills barbarians have, followed by Enhanced Death Blow and Fighter's Death Blow for the fury generation. Next we go 1 point into Pit Fighter, followed by 1 point into No Mercy, and then 2 points into Exposed Vulnerability to unlock the next cluster. Here we take 1 point into Tempered Fury so that we can max out Furious Impulse, and this will be our primary fury generator when swapping weapons. We now put the last point into Exposed Vulnerability and 1 point into Rupture, and now we have our second Weapon Mastery skill, and this gives us 2 skills that we can alternate to cause Whirlwind to proc Vulnerable via Exposed Vulnerability. We now max out both Whirlwind and Pit Fighter to unlock the key passives, and of course we pick Walking Arsenal. And at this point your damage is going to start seriously ramping up. From here we max out Death Blow to increase damage and therefore the chance that it one-shots targets to reset its cooldown, and then we go 1 point into Hamstring before maxing out No Mercy. This gives us the full crit benefit from No Mercy virtually all the time because everything that is bleeding is also slowed and we bleed everything. Next we max out Heavy Handed because now we probably are starting to acquire enough crit chance for it to be useful. And then we max out Pressure Point to give us even more vulnerable uptime, and finally we take Combat Lunging Strike for the added Berserk uptime. Now at this point you should be somewhere between level 40 and 50 depending on your renown status, 40 if you've completed level 3 in all renown, and 50 if you haven't. Regardless, this skill tree should serve you all the way till you complete your renown and progress to a more advanced build. For the remaining 10 points, you can max out Slaying Strike, Thick Skin, and Counter Offensive, in which case you probably want to consider taking the point out of Tactical Rallying Cry and putting it into Strategic Rallying Cry. The final point, really it's up to you. Alright, that rounds off our leveling build. Let's move on to a couple of endgame variants, starting with my two-handed Mace build. Right, so this is my two-handed mace build. There are two variants. There's the tanky variant and the DPS variant. The one I have equipped right now is the tanky variant. I'll show you the DPS variant in a bit. Going over the gear, we have my helm, aspect of might, cooldown reduction, total armor, maximum life, ranks to death blow, chest piece. I use the same chest piece. I use, in fact, really, this is the only gear I swap out, right? One ring, one helm, and one gloves if I want to go for DPS. So everything else is the same. Chest piece, damage reduction from close, fortified, bleeding, and total armor. I have numbing wrath on the chest piece. For the gloves, attack speed, critical strike chance, whirlwind, lucky hit chance for more stuns and more berserk uptime. And I have relentless berserker on the gloves. For the pants, all damage reduction from bleeding, fortified, and total armor. I have Iron Warrior on this. For the boots, berserk duration, movement speed, strength, and fortified generation. I have a few boots that I can swap around with. If I really want to get tanky, I'll equip this one, which is damage reduction whilst injured. If I'm in something like Blind Burrows, one of those instances that has a lot of incoming poison damage, this is what I will use. It does help. Poison enchanted dungeons and stuff, this does help. It's like, maybe like instead of chugging 5 pots, I chug 2 or 3, right? It helps. This is my amulet, two-handed, obviously. I have a different one for my one-handed, which I'll go over later. Two-handed amulet ranks to heavy-handed, total armor, damage reduction from targets that are bleeding, and I have disobedience on the amulet. These are my rings, and they are almost identical in stats, except for this one has HP, right? So we have max HP, critical strike chance, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, berserk fury, perfect roll, so I only need one resource aspect. As long as you have a perfect roll, berserk fury, you only need one resource aspect. For this ring, I wouldn't mind a ring with maximum HP instead of damage versus close, but I haven't found one yet, so this is the ring I use for both the DPS and the tank versions. Critical strike chance, critical strike damage, damage to close, and vulnerable damage. And I have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, my favorite optional offensive aspect, which is Dust Devils. Alright, so for weapons, you'll notice a trend. All stats, strength, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage. All stats, strength, critical strike damage, vulnerable damage. Same thing here. The only difference is I don't have it here because I no longer need the stats on my Paragon board, so I went for close damage instead of all stats. For the aspects, as I explained earlier in the video, two-handed weapons we have Edge Masters and Limitless Rage. One-handed weapons I have Expectant and Retribution because this is a two-handed mace build, and I do not have Dire Whirlwind at all. Going over the skill tree, this is the same skill tree I use regardless of whether I'm going tanky or I'm going DPS. It's the exact same skill tree. Combat Lunging Strike, Whirlwind to Violent Whirlwind, 3 points into Imposing Presence, 3 points into Martial Vigor, max HP, damage reduction from elites, Rallying Cry to Strategic Rallying Cry, Fortified Generation, Iron Skin to Strategic Iron Skin, more Fortified Generation, 1 point into Outburst, 1 point into Tough as Nails. This basically provides all the bleeding that I need. It bleeds targets. Anything that hits me, distant, close, anything that hits me starts bleeding, helps me stack Disobedience, activates all my damage reduction when bleeding. This is a auto bleed, basically. It's a really good combination of passives. Here I have another 3 points into damage reduction, and my Berserk uptime is almost 100%. So this is just basically a flat 9% damage reduction for me. Weapon Mastery Cluster, I have Rupture, just 1 point will do. I only need this just to have the skill. So 1 point into Rupture, 1 point into Death Blow, all the way to Warrior's Death Blow for my Berserking uptime. Having 2 Mastery skills, obviously procs Expose Vulnerability. With the Weapon Masters on my boots, this gives me 2 charges each, which is basically a 100% Walking Arsenal full buff uptime, as well as a 100% vulnerable uptime via Exposed Vulnerability. Otherwise, I have Slaying Strike, Pit Fighter. I didn't take No Mercy. I just don't feel I need the crit. 1 point into thick skin, 3 points in the counter offensive, more damage. The holy trinity of two-handed bludgeoning weapons. We have heavy-handed, wallop, concussion, 1 point into Tempered Fury for 3 points in the Furious Impulse. This is my primary resource generator because I swap weapons a lot, being Walking Arsenal. You swap weapons a lot, and this is your primary Fury generator. Alright, looking at the Paragon tree, and as I explained earlier in the video, this is a really optimized Paragon tree. I've planned it such that I only need to make minor changes to the Paragon tree to swap from a tanky version to a DPS version. Alright, so let me swap to, let me just show you actually live how I swap to my DPS version. I just swap my helm from max HP to strength. I swap to this, I swap to these gloves. The only thing I give up here is lucky hit chance. I swap it to strength. So I swap this ring with this one. And that's all I have to swap for my gear to go from a tanky build to a DPS build. And I remove the points here. I remove the points here. I put the points here. I put the points here. And I put points here. Zero points left. That's it. It's perfectly calculated to swap from tanky to DPS. What do I gain? Quite simply put, I gain damage while fortified, damage while healthy, damage to elites, damage to bleeding targets, more damage whilst berserking, and berserk duration. That's all that changes, and these are my stats in my DPS build. I still have over 10,000 armor. I lose about 400 armor. I do lose, what is it, 3,000 HP? Yeah, I lose 3,000 HP. I gain, yeah, about 100 plus strength because of the gear swaps. And these are my stats in my DPS version. But almost the same critical strike damage. A little bit more vulnerable damage, a little bit more critical strike damage. We don't care about overpower. I gain more damage versus close. Gain more damage versus bleeding. Gain damage whilst healthy. More damage whilst fortified, more damage while berserking, same amount of physical damage. This I don't really care about, and of course this being from Mortal Draw. Alright, so that's it for my two-handed build. Next we'll be talking about my dual wield builds, and let's get straight to it. Alright, so this is my dual wield build, and there are really two variants, just like the two-hand mace build. The two variants, the more tanky variant and the more speed-oriented, damage-oriented variant. What I have equipped right now is the damage-oriented variant, but I will be going over both. Looking at the gear, there are two ways to build this, one with Mobalytics and one without. And honestly, the differences are very minimal. Of course, you swap Mobalytics in, but other than that, it's just changing helms. Helm is really the only place where Maximum Fury would matter in this build, because Mobalytics doesn't really scale that well with Maximum Fury. It's only 0.3%. So the helm is the only place where there isn't anything competing with Maximum Fury for damage. On your rings, you could have close damage instead of Maximum Fury, for example, and then it kind of equalizes out, right? So the only place where Maximum Fury would really matter in this build would be on the helm. So this is the helm I use for Mobalytics. This is the helm I use for not Mobalytics. And for the rest of the gear, honestly, most of it is identical to my two-handed mace build. The only differences are the gloves, the amulet, and the one-handed weapons. So that's what I'll be talking about, starting with the gloves. And really, the primary difference with the gloves is the aspect. I know the stats are different. I just haven't found another pair of gloves that kind of mirror my two-handed build, and I didn't want to replace the aspects. Stat priorities are still the same with gloves. I just changed the aspect from Relentless Berserker to Anemia. And the reason why I have Anemia on the gloves is because with a one-handed setup, Concussion actually gives a lower chance to stun. It's a 30% versus a 45% with a two-handed weapon. So the point of Anemia here is to kind of make up for the chance to stun that I lose going with one-handed weapons. Looking at the amulet, and this is the standard amulet that I use for all my dual wield builds. I have cooldown reduction, total armor, damage reduction from close enemies, and 3 ranks to counter offensive. This in itself is a very good amulet. I've been trying to get the 9.6 armor roll higher. It's not going to give it to me. I can't afford to roll it anymore, so I'm just giving up. I would much prefer to have damage reduction, either flat damage reduction or damage reduction from bleeding enemies instead of damage reduction from close. But you take what you can, right? Looking at the one-handed weapons, and this being the non-Mobalytics variant, I have the highest DPS one-handed sword that I could possibly find, which is currently 812 for 1300 damage per second. I have critical strike damage, vulnerable damage, strength, damage while berserking. This is not ideal. I wish it was something else. Not only is it not ideal to have damage while berserking because the roll is really the range is really low to begin with, but it's also a really low roll within that low range. So this really could improve. And then we have my mace, which is a decent mace. I would prefer critical strike damage instead of damage to close, but this is pretty much as good as it gets already. And I have a non-perfect retribution on this. I wish it was perfect, haven't been able to find one, but 2%, honestly, not much of a difference. Alright, looking at the skill tree, and the only difference between my dual wield build and my two-handed mace build is I take out 3 points from heavy-handed, and I put it into pressure point. And I prefer having pressure point on my dual wield builds because dual wield whirlwind hits faster, so I feel that it has a higher chance to proc pressure point. It just helps, right? More guaranteed vulnerable uptime. Now, I know there have been folks that said, oh, you know, attack speed doesn't affect whirlwind, one-handed weapons or dual wielding, two-handed weapons, there's no difference. There is, and let me explain what's going on here. Okay, so this is really a nomenclature or terminology problem, more so than anything else. Any ARPG or RPG veteran should be familiar with these terms, and that is base attack rate or base attack speed versus increase attack speed. Okay, so base attack speed is the inherent attack rate of the weapon. As you can see here, 1.1 attacks per second. That is the base attack speed of the weapon. If you look at two-handed weapons, it is two-handed mace is 0.9 attacks per second, and two-handed swords is 1 attack per second. So base attack rate affects whirlwind. Increased attack speed doesn't. So that's where folks get it mixed up. And that's why attack speed does matter for whirlwind, because dual wielding has a faster base attack rate. Again, this doesn't matter, this doesn't affect whirlwind, but this does. I hope this clears things up. There's a quick look at the Paragon tree, and the only difference here is being a one-handed build from what I discussed earlier in the video, which was more two-handed focused. The only difference are these two Paragon boards. That being the second board, the Decimator board, and the Flawless Technique board. So in a two-handed build, I have Might in this glyph slot, and then I have Undaunted in this glyph slot. When you swap to a one-handed build, you actually want to have Ambidextrous, which is the one-handed version of Might. You want to have it in this slot because uniquely, when you use a one-handed setup or dual wield setup, you can benefit from the crit nodes here. So what Ambidextrous does is the exact same thing as Might. It buffs the nodes around it. So I get bonus crit damage with one-handed weapons. I get the 8% increased damage, and of course I get the bonus to the damage reduction from close enemies. Of course, it's a trade-off, right? Both of these nodes, okay, both of these boards can have 54 willpower in radius. If you put Ambidextrous here, and you put Undaunted here, what you get is more vulnerable damage and damage reduction from vulnerable targets. If you put it here, you get more critical strike damage. It's really, at this point, personal preference, because these two boards are, the glyphs in these two boards are completely interchangeable. You either go for 54 willpower here, or you go for 54 willpower here. And the other one, you just go 40 strength. Now, of course, this being the DPS variant of the build, I would obviously be putting points into the DPS nodes here and the DPS nodes here. But there's one thing to note about this build uniquely, and that is, as you can see, I have increased berserk duration here, but on my gloves I no longer have Relentless Berserker. I have anemia, so I need some way to make up for that loss in berserk duration. I no longer have a 100% refreshing berserk uptime. So that's why we have increased berserk duration on the boots, as well as we take the increased berserk duration in the Paragon board for a total of 30 from the Paragon board, and I have 31% on my boots, so I have over 60% total increased berserk duration. Right, and that's pretty much the tanky version of the dual wield build, and much like the two-hand mace build, if I just want to swap from tanky version to the DPS version, I just need to go to the Paragon tree and swap the points around. I remove all the points here, I remove all the points here, put all the points down to Tenacity, and the points all the way up to Slayer. And that's my tanky version. It's real simple. Works the same way with my dual wield build, works the same way with my two-handed mace build. It's just about swapping points into the defensive nodes or putting it into the offensive nodes depending on what you want to do. Alright, so of course Mobalytics version, just want to show it real quick. If I swap to the Mobalytics, all I need to do is swap out the helm, and that's it. This is the Mobalytics build. That's all I need to do. Now, there is one little change that I could potentially make to make the Mobalytics build a little bit better, and that is to swap out Dust Devils on the ring for the aspect of the Expectant. That basically gives me 30% more damage to the Whirlwind, but it's kind of personal preference. I still prefer having Dust Devils on my ring, and the reason for that is so I get 30% more damage, multiplicative damage to my Whirlwind if I use Aspect of the Expectant. And that maybe accounts for anywhere between 200 to 400k damage for each Whirlwind hit. But if I use Dust Devils, that also gives me anywhere between 200 to 400k hits from the Dust Devils itself, and the difference being I can spawn multiple Dust Devils, and sometimes the Dust Devils can stack, right? So going Expectant would be better if you're trying to do some more single target or much higher pushing and doing a bit slower pace stuff. But in general, I still prefer having Dust Devils on my ring. Alright folks, that wraps up version 2 of my Walking Arsenal Whirlwind guide. I hope that was helpful to you. Drop me a like if it was, crush that subscribe button if you want to see more Diablo 4 content, and Season 1 should be dropping in about 4 to 5 days from the time this video is uploaded. I'm going to be out of town when Season 1 hits, and I'll only be back like 3 days later. So unfortunately, I'm going to get a late start to the season, but nonetheless, let me know in the comments below, are you looking forward to Season 1? What classes are you guys looking to start with the season? I know I'm personally going with Necro or Rogue because I'm just sick of being underpowered. That was a joke, obviously. I'm actually going to go Sorc for Season 1.